Please rise.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true North, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God, keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Kolod balevav penima nefesh Yehudi omia. Ulfate Mizrach Kadima Ain Letzion Tzofia Od lo avta tikvatenu Hatikva par shnot alpayim liotam chofshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim liotam chofshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim.
Yasher Koach, Cantor Rosen, Shalom and Erev Tov, everyone. Please note that exits are behind you as well as in front of you, and there is a ramped exit through the chapel just beyond this curtain. At a time when Jewish indigeneity in the land of Israel is denied by many, it is important to acknowledge the land on which we gather and the many nations who have cared for this land throughout the millennia, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. We are blessed to be able to worship and work, study and serve on this land today. We pledge ourselves to the ongoing work of truth and reconciliation and to respond to the 94 calls to action. Welcome congregants and guests, rabbis and faith leaders, friends and allies. Welcome to those who have joined us through the live stream and to those who have joined us in this sanctuary, which was built in 1938 when anti-Semitism was raging in this country. 200 Jewish families then not only had the foresight to move Toronto's first synagogue from downtown up Bathurst Street, not only had the chutzpah to build the sanctuary to seat 1,000 people, but they also had the determination to build it in such a way that it would send a message to the entire city. What was that message? We aren't going anywhere. We will work hard and contribute to this good country. The landmark Hilltop Synagogue with the Lions of Judah guarding its heavy oak doors was a clear message in concrete. We will not apologize for being who we are, and we will not cower to those who hate us. Let us draw strength from our forebears now. Just a few short hours ago, I returned from a congregational tour of Morocco, where Jewish life took hold and often flourished over the course of 2,500 years. Some Jews arrived with the destruction of Jerusalem's temple. Some had fled the Spanish and Portuguese inquisitions, some from Vichy France. Throughout the ages, the kings of Morocco protected their Jews. They built the royal palaces right next to the melachs, the Jewish districts of Morocco's cities. And when Hitler called for Mohammed V to deport Morocco's 250,000 Jews to Nazi concentration camps, the Sultan flatly refused and famously said, "There are no Jews in Morocco. There are only Moroccan subjects, and it is my duty to protect them against aggression." While only 2,000 remain in Morocco today, Jews of Moroccan descent, whether they live in Casablanca, Jerusalem, or Montreal, praise King Mohammed VI, who leads his Muslim country as a democracy with little tolerance for public displays of antisemitism and anti-Zionism. Every synagogue, every Jewish school, and every Jewish cemetery we visited is secured by police and government protections. Every museum that told the history of Morocco, proudly included the history of the Jews of Morocco and the contributions they made throughout the centuries. Why do I share this with you? Because, in all honesty, being there for 10 days brought a surprising relief for my fellow travelers and me. It was a welcome respite from the blatant and constant demonstrations of the Jew hatred we witnessed first and second hand here in our home country of Canada. This week, while rockets, missiles, and drones relentlessly rained down on Israel's north and south and center, while mobs in Amsterdam openly attacked Jewish soccer fans on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, while 101 Jews are still held captive in the tunnels of Gaza, we wonder when we will wake up from the nightmare that has become our daily routines. This past Shabbat, in anticipation of Remembrance Day, we honored the living veterans of our congregation, and we said Kaddish for the 24 young men of Holy Blossom who fell in battle during World War I and World War II. They were proud to wear Canada's uniform and proud to join their fellow Canadians in the fight against tyranny. How we long for that national unity today. How we yearn for that clarity of cause today. Let us find a measure of their courage. We thank Special Envoy Lyons for being among those who work day and night to discern right from wrong, to clarify truth and call out dangerous lies. We wish we didn't need you to play this role, but sadly, we need you, and Canada needs you. Every Shabbat, we rise and pray sincerely for this country, which we are still proud to call home. We say, we pray for all who serve in positions of leadership and responsibility in our national life, so that Canada may be to the world an example of justice and compassion. Deepen our love for our country and our desire to serve it. Cause us to see clearly that the well-being of our nation is in the hands of all its citizens. And together we say, Amen. It is our great honor to learn tonight from Canada's Special Envoy for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Deborah Lyons is a diplomat with 25 years of experience in international relations, political affairs, security management, and development. She has served as Ambassador of Canada to Israel, Ambassador of Canada to Afghanistan, Deputy Ambassador of Canada to the United States, as well as serving in a number of positions representing Canada at the UN. Deborah Lyons is a great Canadian, known for advancing democracies worldwide, defending human rights, and strengthening civil societies in some of the world's toughest regions. To begin tonight's program, Special Envoy Lyons will be in conversation with Holy Blossom's own Tom Friedland. When Tom isn't busy as a professional law partner at Goodman's LLP, he is devoting himself to numerous ambitious volunteer projects. Here at Holy Blossom, Tom was the chair of our Renewal Project Steering Committee, which was responsible for every aspect of creating our new and renewed spaces. We will forever be grateful to him. Tom has served in various roles on our temple board for more than 10 years, I believe, and before that, as co-chair of our Out of the Cold program for unhoused, underfed, and dangerously lonely Torontonians. Together with his wife, Jackie, Tom was the inaugural recipient of Holy Blossom Temple's President's Award. Tonight, Tom will be representing Holy Blossom's Advocacy Committee, which was established in response to the ripple effects and the shock waves experienced in Canada in the aftermath of October 7th. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Lyons and Tom Friedland for what promises to be an illuminating evening.
Thank you, Rabbi, for the kind introduction. I know you're just back from Morocco this afternoon, so if, notwithstanding the fascinating discussion, you doze off, we'll understand. Not a chance. Special Envoy Lyons, on behalf of your host for this evening, the Advocacy Committee of Holy Blossom Temple, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would just quickly introduce the members of the Advocacy Committee. Hiding at the back is Michael Davis, our chair. Michael, wave a hand, he's way at the back. And also Eli Mogul over here. And I think I saw Corrine Krieger also at the back near Michael. And we have the excellent leadership of Rabbi Kaye as well. Thank you. A couple of other administrative items. We have QR codes for you all. This is a link to our Advocacy Committee webpage, and from there you can link to the Canadian Handbook on the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which will be central to our discussion this evening. Please use it as a resource, but kids, stay off your phones here in the sanctuary, please. The format for the evening will be a quick discussion, a little back and forth. We're going to cover some of the key topics about the Special Envoy position, anti-Semitism in Canada, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the handbook itself, and some action steps that can be taken, and then we'll have a quick Q&A after. I think, Special Envoy, before we jump into those topics, can you give us a little introduction to your personal background, please? It should just be on once you put it up.
Oh, it's already on. Good. Important that I don't get to press any buttons. Well, thank you, Tom, very much, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight and being in this beautiful place of worship. Frankly, I always find it so comforting, and I think we need comfort these days. So a little bit about myself.
Yeah, personal background. I know you grew up in New Brunswick, and so let's start there.
Yeah, exactly. Good start, Susan. So I grew up in New Brunswick in a huge family, 9 kids. My father came from a family of 12, and in rural northern New Brunswick, and so I learned right away the importance of community and the importance of people coming together to help one another. No one had any money. There weren't many social programs in those days. And the only way people could survive was by looking after one another. So to some extent, I think it was destined that I would become a diplomat, because I consider diplomacy to be simply communities taking care of one another, but on a global level. So my career was long and vast, and I joined Foreign Affairs in 1999, and before that had various other jobs because I was always very interested in economic development, of course, being an Atlantic Canadian and feeling that central Canada dominated and that we needed to find a way of pulling ourselves up from our bootstraps, so I got very involved in community development, economic development, and that led me to trade. Some of my trade colleagues are here tonight, and trade, of course, took me to international. And from there, it just developed. I was very lucky to have wonderful assignments in Afghanistan. And I remember the night that I got the phone call about Israel. It felt like destiny, I must say again, because it was the one country that my mother, who had grown up as a Protestant and converted to Catholicism with my father, and had a very, very difficult life with her 9 children and poverty and so forth, the one country in the world she wanted to get to before she died was Israel. Israel was everything to her. And I kept saying, we're going to take you, Mom, don't worry, we're going to take you. As soon as we get the money, we're going to take you. And of course, she died before I was able to do that. So the night I got the phone call from Foreign Affairs saying, we want you to go to Israel, I thought, the power of mothers is phenomenal.
So my mother's here too tonight. So.
Good son there, mother, another good son.
My father too, so I don't get in any trouble, and my wife also, and one of my kids. No, I don't have 9 kids though, so it's okay.
Okay, Tom, what's the name of your dog?
Yeah, I can't. Muffin is not here tonight.
Oh, okay. So, okay, I had 4 magnificent years in Israel, where I learned how incredibly attached to Israel the Jewish community globally was, how much it was a part of not just the faith, but how much it was a part of the identity. And that attachment to Israel, of course, has stayed with me. I also got to, because of being ambassador, to spend a lot of time with the Jewish community across Canada, which was great training for this job. I also, though, saw when I went to Israel, because I was very keen on the 2-state solution, because I continue to believe that that is the only future for that part of the Middle East. So when I arrived in Israel, I immediately started talking to other ambassadors about what are we doing on the 2-state, what's happening, how can Canada play a bigger role, because to that point, Canada had played a very significant role. And frankly, what I received from the diplomatic community was nothing but frustration and disgust that nothing was going to happen on the 2-state, that the Israelis weren't interested, or at least the Israeli government wasn't interested, nor were the Palestinians, nor the Palestinian Authority, nor was there necessarily capacity. That was very disappointing and very concerning, but again, a good lesson for me to learn and to experience that frustration. I remember going from ambassador to ambassador to ambassador and getting the same reaction. The other thing I experienced, just very quickly, when I was in Israel, and I experienced it again when I went to Afghanistan with the UN, is how quickly things fall apart. How quickly you can go from thinking that maybe we've reached some stability, and then in a moment's notice, the Taliban walk into Kabul. Or you have protests along the fence that end up hurting both Palestinians and Israelis and implicating Canada. And I also learned how quickly you fade from importance, whatever your issue is. You may have prominence one moment, but the world moves on to the next crisis. All of these, I think, useful lessons for where we are today.
There's a book that my eldest son forced me to read a couple years ago called Things Fall Apart by a Nigerian author about the Biafran Civil War. So I hope we're not as in that kind of trouble. Let me just go back a little bit to your upbringing. I have a friend who I met at law school at McGill, who grew up in New Brunswick and went to St. FX, and he had before,
which is in Nova Scotia, by the way.
In Nova Scotia,
okay.
Before he showed up at McGill, he had never met a Jewish person.
Yes.
Did you meet any Jews growing up in New Brunswick, or how did you end up, knowing about the Jews in the way that you have?
I think, frankly, sadly, my first real association with the Jews was learning about the Holocaust. And as I said recently at another event, it marked me as a child. It marked me that I belonged to a humanity that was capable of such incredible cruelty. And I think that stayed with me as a child and affected me for the rest of my life in terms of issues of social justice, hatred, of polarization, and no doubt had an influence on me becoming a diplomat as well. I did, though, at university, meet many Jewish Canadians, one in particular who I had a wicked crush on for a long time, and we used to meet on Friday nights at the library because we were both nerds, and he was magnificent, and he's now a very famous painter. And I should have nabbed him, but I didn't have the wisdom. But anyway, and then, I will go on and say that we have a beautiful synagogue in Fredericton and another beautiful one in St. John and in Moncton. And many years later, my daughter actually ended up going to the synagogue in Moncton, New Brunswick, when I was working there in economic development. So, not as a young child growing up. I'll tell you what I experienced as a young child growing up that was preparation, though. I experienced the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants. In our community, it was very marked, very differentiated. It might be one thing to date a Protestant boy, but not for too long. And if you converted to from Catholicism to Protestantism, I can still remember the priest chasing my aunt out of the graveyard at my grandfather's funeral, telling her that her soul was damned for all time because she had married a Protestant. I saw that ridiculous hatred that should never have been a part of religious communities all my life growing up as a child in northern New Brunswick. It isn't like that now, thankfully. But I think many of us experience that.
Thank you for that. It's always good to know someone's background and their kind of backstory and how they ended up in a position like the one that you have. It's obvious from your time as the ambassador to Israel that you have qualifications for the Special Envoy position, and we do want to hear about the Special Envoy position. But is this a job that you applied for? Did you go looking for it? Were you approached?
I don't know how much I should tell the truth.
You should always tell the truth.
Thank you, Tom.
Not that it's recorded or anything.
I'm in a place of worship. I will tell the truth.
Great.
Look, it was in Jerusalem. I was having lunch with Erwin Kotler, and I was telling him about the negotiations I was involved in with the Taliban. Because at this point, I'm head of the United Nations in Afghanistan, and the Taliban is now the de facto authority. And Erwin stops me mid-sentence after a while and says, I know what you have to do next. You have to follow me in this job.
And Erwin, of course, was the first Special Envoy.
Special Envoy. This would have been in April of 2022. And I said to him, Erwin, no, I am retiring after this. I'm going to learn how to cook. I'm going to play with my grandchildren. I'm going to live life. And Erwin, of course, as all of you may know, is very convincing.
He was my constitutional law professor in first year.
So you would know. And he kept coming back to me and coming back to me. I said initially, no, look, I'm not Jewish. Maybe, it should be a Jewish person heading that up. And then I thought, no, Deborah, that's stupid, frankly, because we're all here for one another. So it's actually very symbolic that it's a non-Jew in the position. So that your argument doesn't hold water. I told Erwin I was too old to take the job. That doesn't work with Erwin either. Eventually, we talked over a year. I said I couldn't do it for a little while. And then Tom, it just kept pulling me in and pulling me in. And I guess something that I should mention about my postings abroad, and especially my last 2 years in Afghanistan, from 2020 to 2022, when you're a diplomat abroad, and I've got some colleagues here tonight, you can always feel so good about Canada. I used to refer to us as Canada the good. Not the great, no superlatives, they don't work, but Canada the good. And then in those years, 2020 to 2022, I would look back at Canada and think, what is happening to my country? What is happening with the polarization that I see? What's happening with the hate speech? What is happening? And I knew that even if I was to retire, I would have to still stay engaged somehow in trying to address the polarization that I could feel happening, even from a distance. I could feel happening in my country, and particularly the hate speech and the vulgar hateful rhetoric that we were hearing even from political leaders, let alone on the streets and online. So I knew I was going to be doing some work in this, and so to some extent the job just kept pulling me in, and I finally accepted around June of 2023, did some work preparing over the summer, went to Ottawa in September to get ready. We were supposed to announce the end of September, but Erwin wasn't available, so we delayed it to October 16th.
All right. This seems like well, at least now we know that, in fact, what Erwin did is he anointed his successor. And I think this would be a good point for you to tell us what the Special Envoy position is and what the mandate is.
So it's just as simple as the title. It's combating anti-Semitism and also preserving Holocaust remembrance. So I work both on Holocaust remembrance with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, with the Holocaust museums and educators across the country, working with the ministries of education to ensure that we've got stronger and better, more robust Holocaust education, working with stakeholders on all of that, and also, of course, working to combat anti-Semitism. The job is also, of course, not just working with stakeholders outside of Ottawa, but very much working within the federal government system, advising ministers and looking at our different departments in terms of the role that they need to be playing. It's also very unique, Canada's Special Envoy, because it's both domestic and international. And that's important to acknowledge because it means an enormous amount of work right now. In the case of the US, as an example, Deborah Lipsat, a good friend of mine, who, by the way, is going to be in Toronto next week, she's actually in Amsterdam, by the way, for Shabbat on Friday. Deborah's role is only international. She does not do anything on the domestic front in the US on combating anti-Semitism. Equally, the Special Envoy for Holocaust Remembrance, Ellen Germain, her role as the US envoy is only external. It is not domestic. I thought when I took this role, as did my wonderful colleague Rachel Cherkoff, who's sitting here in the front row, I was smart enough to come to Toronto and grab Rachel. In fact, I insisted with the ministers that I would not take the job unless she came to my team. Thank heavens. But I had thought that the job was going to be 50-50, 50 domestic, 50 international, more or less. After October 7th, that all changed. It is easily 90, 95% some days, sometimes 150% domestic. And I report to two ministers. I report to the Minister of Inclusivity and Minister Kira, for inclusion and diversity, and I report to Minister Jolie on the foreign affairs side. I do not do geopolitical. Let me point that out. I report to Jolie because of the international role I play with the International Holocaust Alliance.
Perfect. So let's come back to your specific role in a moment, but obviously the world changed on October 7th. You'd already accepted the appointment, or at least our world changed.
Haven't been announced publicly, but yeah.
But you knew you were involved. Is the job completely different than what you thought it was going to be, or is it very much the same, just with a more intense focus now?
It is absolutely different in the sense that it is a battleground every day. It is very intense. I had planned prior to October 7th to, again, picking up from the wisdom of Erwin, to make sure that we established in the two departments a solid team, because Erwin had no staff when he was Special Envoy. And I wanted to make sure that we had a solid office that would endure and sustain after I left or other Special Envoys came, which we now have in both departments. And I knew that anti-Semitism, in particular, was systemic. And so we needed to make sure that we were building fortresses within those systems to fight it on an ongoing basis. So, working in education, working with universities, working on data collection so we could demonstrate to the political world just what was happening out there. And again, this is before October 7th. Working on social media, a huge challenge, of course, and working with law enforcement. So those were the key priority areas we were going to be focusing on when October 7th happened. Those priorities, frankly, all moved. I wouldn't say that we didn't continue to work on. In fact, we're working on them almost in steroids. But it became work that we had to do within this very inflamed, hurtful, painful, anxious environment that our Jewish community was having to endure here in Canada after October 7th. And that, in my view, was not being adequately recognized by leaders throughout the spectrum of society, or frankly by Canadians generally. So we found ourselves doing even more work in the area of communications, doing more work inside government to ensure that public servants, certainly at the federal level, but also at the provincial level, understand what needs to be done in terms of their policies, in terms of their programs, in terms of training. And then additionally, we realized that we had to address equity, diversity, and inclusivity, which had become a massive social justice response in offices, in the government, at universities, but that frankly excluded the Jewish community for the most part. And so the more we started to work on the issues, the more issues frankly cropped up, which also led me to realize that I had to produce the IRA handbook, the Canadian Handbook, on the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, because we needed to help people understand how anti-Semitism was presenting itself in Canada and what we needed to do to try to combat it.
Great. So we'll come to a bit more of a discussion about the IRA definition and the handbook itself, but just about the role itself. So you've told us that you give advice to ministers. I had the privilege of interviewing Member of Parliament Anthony Housefather, who is the government's special advisor on Jewish community relations and anti-Semitism. How does his job as a member of the government differ from yours?
Well, actually, I just consider Anthony to be more bench strength, and I think he considers me to be more bench strength. I'm not going to look a gift pony, you know. Here's somebody who's very committed to this, who really wants to get things done, and who has influence and power and status that I don't have. So let's work together as a team and get as much happening as we can. And that's what we've been doing. Anthony has a particularly useful role for us on this, what I call inside government work that we're doing, because he can go as a parliamentary secretary for Treasury Board and actually meet with the ministers to ensure that we've got attestations in place for grant programs, to ensure that the anti-racism strategy, again, that is underpinned by the IRA definition, is being fully implemented by all the departments now as a result of the latest version of that strategy, 2.0. It applies to every federal government department. Anthony can play a critical role there alongside of us, equally working with me on a whole host of other issues that come up related to concerns that the Jewish community have. I am not going to, Tom, sit here and suggest that when somebody offers to me a person with seniority and capability and strength and power, that I say, oh, gee, are they stepping on my territory? Oh, dear, what a shame. No, I'm going to... And
just to be clear, he spoke...
You weren't insinuating
He
that.
spoke very highly of you and said you play nicely together as well, so no risk there.
Well,
but related to that, though, you're a government appointee, and your job, I imagine, is supposed to be nonpartisan politically. Yes. Are you able to interact effectively with the opposition parties as well, with the Conservatives, with the New Democrats, with the Bloc? How's the interaction with those parties?
Absolutely. In fact, I have friends and colleagues in all four parties, and I have worked and met with representatives of all four parties, including leaders of most of the parties, not all of them, but most of them. And I think it's absolutely essential that the Special Envoy job is nonpartisan. It would be ridiculous for it to be anything other. because we're working on behalf of Canadians, and in particular on behalf of the Jewish community. And one thing I do when I meet all four parties is I remind them how offensive I consider it to be when they make anti-Semitism or Holocaust a politically partisan issue. That it is a disservice to the community and it is a dishonor to the importance of these issues.
Well, I think even in the United States, we don't have to talk about the United States at all at the moment. But support for Israel is very much cross-political, and they work together. And it isn't my sense that the political parties work together on the Israel issue here very well, maybe a bit more so on anti-Semitism. Do you have a sense of that? Or should they be working more together?
I'll take your message back to Ottawa with me, Tom, because frankly, they no question, of course, they could work more together. I mean, we have Friends of Israel caucus with whom we work, and as I said, we've got MPs in all four parties who are very committed to these issues and with whom we work on a weekly basis at least. Is there more they can be doing? Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about anti-Semitism in Canada as a lead into the IRA definition. Can you give us some high-level statistics of how pervasive you think it is now and how much that's changed since October 7th?
So just before we started the event tonight, Tom and I were talking about when do we know if we're overreacting to what's happening out there? And when do we know if we're underreacting? And I have to tell you, from my perspective, what I see every day is very troubling. And I think we are underreacting. I think we have to be careful about the volume and inflaming, our own reactions. But let me give you a few statistics. 70% of all religiously motivated incidents, hate incidents in Canada, 70% are all targeted on the Jewish community, a community that makes up 1% of the Canadian population. I use those stats all the time. Remember what I said earlier about data collection? We need solid data collection so we can demonstrate to the political leaders and frankly in leaders in business and everywhere just how extreme this is. Secondly, both in 2023 and now in the first 2 quarters of 2024, anti-Semitism tops the chart for all hate crimes, no matter the motivation, religious or otherwise. The first time ever in Canada that anti-Semitism topped that chart, ahead of Black Lives Matter, which again we don't want on the chart, ahead of LGBTQ, and frankly, double the latest data in terms of Muslim hatred. This is very serious, what is happening. So I'll just give you those two data points, but I will also give you what I consider to be probably one of the most compelling pictures, and that is a non-Jewish family taking their kids for swimming classes on a weekend morning, just walking into the community center and taking their kids for swim classes. And then we move to a Jewish family taking their kids to swimming classes at the JCC, and they don't get to enter that building without passing by a police car. I'm sorry, those two comparisons I think are very vivid.
Do you think there's been too much complacency in the Jewish community about anti-Semitism? I mean, growing up, I'm fairly old now, I never really experienced any anti-Semitism, but we know that there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Canada, back to quotas in universities or none is too many, Irving Abella's book about Jews being, the St. Louis, and Jews being welcome after the war, or during the war, prior to the war in Canada. The Jewish community become too complacent?
I think Canadians have become too complacent, frankly, in terms of I lived abroad actually for like 12 years from 2000 on, and again in South Asia and in the Middle East. And one of the things that I recognized was the island of North America. You know, we have it pretty good. We live with one neighbor who's pretty friendly and pretty compatible. And I think as much, Tom, as we have made such tremendous changes in the last 50 years or so in our lifetime, in terms of enshrining, human rights, in terms of being truly a country of rule of law, in terms of trying to be a country that is reconciling with its indigenous people at long last, I think we've really advanced incredibly, and I think we forgot that we have to remain alert and be constantly protecting these rights and these laws and ensuring that we're able to adapt to the changes that are taking place within our country and that have to be taking place as Canada becomes part of that global community. So I think overall we were too complacent, and I think that what has happened with this crisis in the aftermath of October 7th is that we are being given a real test as to what kind of country we want to be. Maybe one of the first tests in a long time in terms of how do we want to work to ensure that all of our citizens feel supported and protected and can flourish, and at the same time ensure all of those other things that are so important to us, like freedom of speech and to some degree almost a type of permissiveness in our society that allows people to be who they want to be, and to bring their cultures and to bring their own opinions to the group. How do we do this in a way that keeps us as Canadians and underpins those values that are near and dear to us, but that also, recognizes that diversity and accepts that much of the world is going through similar challenges, and we need to be prepared to do it as well. I consider this to be a crisis, and I say this to the ministers all the time and to the Prime Minister. I consider this to be a crisis that we're going through, that we need to turn into a catharsis, that we need to come out of this better than what we have, because of what it has presented to us.
Some people who might say that we're actually overreacting would say that it's really just a vocal and loudly vocal minority who are anti-Semitic, who, you see a protest and there's 150 people or 200 people, and it's not what the silent majority thinks. The silent majority in Canada respects rule of law, respects the different cultures and communities we have here, and is not inherently anti-Semitic. Is that possibly what's happening here, and that we're just being, the statistics are real, obviously, but that we're being pushed into feeling that it's a crisis because of a loud vocal minority?
Yeah. I think that we are talking about a loud and very vocal minority, for sure. I would highlight, for those of you who haven't seen it, I'm sure many of you have, Bob Brim's study, Professor Brim's study, where he surveyed Canadians in February of last year. He's going to do it again this year. And what he's telling from his analysis is that by far and away, the majority of Canadians, non-Jewish Canadians, support the Jewish community in Canada. By far and away, the majority. And they also support Israel, Israel's right to exist, and are very positive there. Where you see a more negative attitudes is in people aged 18 to 24, a lot of work that we have to do there, university students, and in some communities who obviously feel impacted by what's happening in the Middle East right now. So yes, we have a vocal minority. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to them and making sure that their voices are heard in a peaceful way, and that we're responding to that. But at the same time, when we see it being played out as shots at Jewish businesses, and we heard tonight that possibly there was another one recently, shots at elementary girls' schools, firebombing of synagogues like my synagogue in Moncton. All of these then need to be addressed. And what I worry about is the extent to which we're speaking up and speaking out, the extent to which community leaders are saying this is wrong, and the extent to which we're able to apply appropriately the laws, the codes of conduct that need to address when that vocal minority, I think, steps beyond the point of reason.
Okay, thank you for that. There's no doubt that a lot of the current anti-Semitism is an outflow of the seven-front war that Israel is fighting against Hamas and Hezbollah and the friends in the neighborhood. How much of it is also driven by the current political climate where politicians seem to go to the lowest common denominator and vilify minorities and immigrants, as we've seen in the election to the south, and amplify misinformation? How much of that drives anti-Semitism?
I don't know what I would say the percentage of that would be, but a small degree would be too much, because we should be expecting much more from our political leaders than actually turning us against one another. I also reject the fact that this is an immigration problem. I reject that completely. There are as many people out there in the demonstrations who would be what many people would consider to be traditional Canadians from 100 years ago or 200 years ago, as there are newcomers and possibly even more. So it's a combination of people, and I worry about anyone. And I've heard a couple of politicians from two different parties make that assertion, and I've had to speak to them afterwards because I think it's a very dangerous road to go down. What we do need to be doing, without question, we do need to continue with our immigration. We may need to make some changes to our policy. I know the Minister Miller has made some changes to the numbers. We maybe do need to do more work to help our new immigrants understand the Canadian society, Canadian values, and so forth. But to pin this on immigrants is completely wrong and very dangerous. And we're going to see the impact of that soon.
And do you believe that the tenor of the political discourse that we have in the United States, which seems sometimes to be reflected in Canada, is also a contributing factor?
Well, I think whenever the political tenor emphasizes divisiveness, polarization, victimizes, frankly, seeing political people speak in a way that we wouldn't allow our teenagers to speak, our children to speak, I think, yes, it contributes. And I'm happy to say that I think here in Canada we're doing pretty well, but I do worry that the political discourse, as we move into an election year next year, could start to deteriorate once again.
Let's talk for a second about how anti-Semitism in Canada maybe compares to anti-Semitism elsewhere in the world. We've obviously just seen what's often described as the pogrom that happened in Amsterdam last week. Bret Stephens in the New York Times a couple of days ago described it as a Jew hunt, or a Jodenjagd in Dutch, in his words, just close to the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht. Can that happen here? Where the Maccabi Tel Aviv basketball team played in Toronto, a few years ago. What would stop that from happening here?
So you started out by saying, is it different in Canada than in other places in the world? Here's how I describe what happened after October 7th. We broke early. We fell apart early, faster than a number of other countries. And I think it'll be interesting for us to reflect on why that happened. I was getting phone calls from my counterparts, the other international special envoys, saying, what's going on in Canada? This is crazy. We're seeing stuff on the news about what's happening at universities, what's happening on the streets in Canada, the stores that have been red paint thrown on them, et cetera. These are people calling me from Europe to ask me what's going on in Canada. We didn't think Canada was like this. Even the U.S. in those early days were not as bad as we were in the first three, maybe 5 months. We broke early, but then they all caught up and surpassed us in many ways. Excuse me. Do I think that something like happened in Amsterdam could happen here in Canada? I'd have to say I don't think so. I really don't. But I also have been surprised before, and I was surprised by what happened after October 7th. But I feel that in this past year, at long last, people are starting to realize that we must take action. And I'm seeing it at the provincial level. I hope to see more at the municipal level. I know it's happening at the federal level. It's not happening as fast or as much as any of us here in this beautiful synagogue want, but it's happening. But, you know, as I said earlier, we've all experienced life where things fall apart quickly and surprise you.
So your appointment document says that anti-Semitism is not a problem for the Jewish community to confront alone. And many would say that the impacts are also an attack on Western values or democracy, that the Jews are really just the canary in the coal mine, just to cite some of the examples. As the members of the Jewish community, we, and I should say there are many members of our interfaith allies here this evening and watching online, and we thank them for participating in this discussion. But the Jews in the audience have a good appreciation for how we felt anxious or worried about our own personal safety despite the increased police presence that we've seen. You know, we've seen it on campus, we've seen it on the city streets, we've seen it in the communities with the shooting, we've seen it in what many of us would consider one-sided media, with selective interviews, etc. But what are the impacts of anti-Semitism on Canadian civil society or on Western values or democratic values, in your view?
Well, again, Tom, sorry, I would say that's part of the reason I'm doing this job. I think that this is, yes, a crisis for our Jewish community, but it is a crisis for Canada. I think that we are seeing, you know, a challenge that our police chiefs faced in the early days as to just how far they needed to go to intervene during many of these demonstrations and protests, well aware of the fact that they may be charged with police brutality so quickly, wondering about the support that they might or might not be getting from their municipal politicians backing them up. I think we've seen in our school system that we need to be ensuring more education on the Holocaust. And even as we try to put that in place, we're aware of of anti-Semitic sentiments that we feel we're hearing from some of our school boards across the country and from of our teachers. So how do you ensure that you've got a strong Holocaust education curriculum when the children are being taught in that kind of environment? So I think that, again, and I hate to say it, because being the chosen people should be a beautiful thing. But I think, once again, the Jewish community are the chosen people to walk Canada through this crisis at this moment as we try to come to terms with how do we protect our values as Canadians. How do we protect one another? So yes, I think we say all the time as the International Special Envoys that anti-Semitism is a threat to democracy, without question, and to democratic values. It is also a threat to our national security and to international security. How we deal with this now is going to impact all of those areas.
Okay, so one of the ways we're dealing with it, good segue, is the Canadian Handbook on the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which I'd like you to tell us about, of course. But
is this the first time I've seen it so nicely bound?
No, I had it bound at my office. It's color.
The Canadian government can't afford that. So.
Yeah, exactly. We just have a QR code so you can read it. Before we jump into the handbook, though, I think we need to explain what the IRA definition is. And I understand that it has 4 parts to it. Can you just give us a brief overview of the IRA definition, why it was created,
Okay.
why it's necessary,
so just very quickly, the IRA definition literally started out 16 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, with the European Monitoring Center for Racism and Xenophobia developing a definition for anti-Semitism. That then got approved within the Ottawa Protocol by our Parliament, by all 4 parties. It was reaffirmed again by our Parliament in 2015. It then became officially known through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance as the IRA definition and fully adopted, and now has been adopted by 43 countries around the world. So 16 years of developing this definition. It is the gold standard global definition for anti-Semitism. It is not an easy definition. And there are others that may in fact be easier, a few others that people like to quote. But this is the definition that has been adopted by 43 countries after an enormous amount of work by academics, by rabbis. The list goes on. Hundreds of people contributed to it. It also underpins, I should say, our anti-racism strategy and the Canadian Action Plan for Combating Hate. It is complicated. It has 4 parts to it. The first is simply the definition, which when you read it is actually very general.
Can I read it?
Yes.
So this is what's called the core definition, page 17 of the PDF. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities.
Right. So to underpin that rather general description, there are 11 examples of how this would play out, how the anti-Semitism might manifest. And they talk about Jews being seen as being guilty for the evils of society. A perfect example would have been during COVID when people said, well, it was the Jews who created COVID so that they could create the vaccine. I mean, we have various examples. In any case, these 11 examples are what are referred to, excuse me, as the illustrative examples. In our handbook, which is very unique, by the way, in the global community, we explain how the illustrative examples that reinforce that definition, but also we refer to what we call the preamble. So this is, the preamble talks about how these examples play out with regard to how we interpret anti-Semitism and conspiratorial theories of the past and how anti-Semitism has changed over time. It also highlights how the treatment of Israel, i.e. criticism of Israel, can be seen as discriminatory if it is differential to how other countries are treated. So the definition, the preamble that introduces the examples, then the 11 examples, and then the postscript that talks briefly and helps to interpret how this definition complements. It is non-binding, it's a non-legal definition, non-binding, but how it complements existing laws in any given country. So it's a very complete analysis done by a wonderful drafter who worked with us to put this together. I also want to highlight that this was then tested by all of the government lawyers who we had to go through in order to eventually produce the handbook. So lawyers from Justice, from Public Safety, from Privy Council Office, from Heritage, from Global Affairs, etc., who actually had to examine this as well and ensure that it met the test. Because what I want you to go away with tonight, if you go away with nothing else, this is a Government of Canada handbook. It is not a handbook of the Special Envoy's office. It's a handbook of the Government of Canada. That was critical, that it came out and it took some convincing, but it had to be a Government of Canada handbook because it has to hold government accountable as well, but it also has to endure and make its way through time. This is an anchor document for anti-Semitism in Canada and for the government. I should also say that the majority of our provinces have also adopted, in addition to the Government of Canada, the majority of our provinces have adopted the IHRA definition. So this handbook has been sent to all federal departments, to all provincial governments, particularly ministers of education and ministers of advanced education, to the premiers, to all the mayors, to chiefs of police, to school boards. I could go on.
So I understand from the introduction to the handbook that it has two objectives. One is to help people in Canada understand what anti-Semitism is, and second, to provide non-prescriptive guidance on how the definition can be used as an effective resource in efforts to address and combat anti-Semitism. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went about, because I know your office was the primary initial author of the handbook, how you went about developing the handbook?
So we actually looked at the EU model. The European Union had produced a handbook on the IHRA definition. We looked at their model. The IHRA organization itself had produced one, not giving case studies supporting the examples, but actually explaining the definition. The EU handbook took the 11 illustrated examples and under each of those listed 2 or 3 real-life cases from different member countries of anti-Semitism happening. This was an excellent model, and we wanted to make sure that we adopted it. So you will see in this handbook some 30 to 40 to 50 stories, real-life cases of how anti-Semitism has played out as per these 11 examples.
And these came out of interviews and town halls that you...
And yeah, I was just going to go to that. So we also, in putting this together, identified how different players and actors in society could use this handbook and could use the definition and apply it. In order for this to really stand the test of a government handbook, it had to be well consulted. So we started in Vancouver and went right across the country, consulted over 150 people outside of government, obviously law enforcement, prosecutors, police, judges, university professors, a number of people who are here in the group tonight, people from the political world from all sides, people who disagreed with the IHRA definition. Who am I forgetting? So
Rabbi Splansky.
Pardon me?
Rabbi Splansky.
She was in the Toronto session. It wasn't easy. People had to be with us for 3 hours to go through it. What happened as a result of taking pretty much, the model of the European Union and testing it with 150 people, what did we find out? We had Jews and non-Jews in the consultations, 150. We found out that people wanted more. They wanted us to talk about Zionism in the handbook. They wanted us to talk about who are the Jews, what is the history of the Jews in Canada, what is the history of anti-Semitism in Canada. A number of issues that it became clear to me we could incorporate in the handbook and make it a little bit bigger. It's some 55 pages, but that also there is a crying need out there, and maybe this is something we can talk to your advocacy committee about. There's a crying need out there for more information on anti-Semitism and on Jewish life in Canada. And so I think we need to be looking now at a number of companion documents, companion pieces that can be 2-3 pages, that would accompany the handbook.
Are those in the works?
We have a list of them. We haven't started the work on them yet. We're still recovering from getting the handbook out. But I also just want to say that in addition to the 150 people that we consulted externally, we then had to go through the government process, and Rachel led a lot of that. And she can tell you that wasn't easy. We were in the grinder. Could this be a government-backed document? And we spent 3-4 months, I think almost 4 months, with public servants, political staffers, and lots of legal people and policy advisors in ensuring that this could land as a government document. It is a solid document.
Is there anything notable that through the scrubbing, grinding process was left out that you wanted to say? Because you can say it now. I think we said we were going to be truthful here.
But stay tuned, because there'll be some of the companion documents. I think one of the best moments for me was when we had a session, you'll remember this, Rachel, with political staffers, so from 5 or 6 different ministries. And they came in and they had been given the handbook to read. They had an hour to read it. And I remember this one, she was not Jewish, saying, I had no idea. I had no idea this was happening in my country. And she was a political staffer, and I loved her honesty. And I thought that this is what this handbook is needed. It's needed as an so you talked about the objectives. It's needed first and foremost as an educational tool.
So,
yes?
So how do you get people to read it? Who's the audience, and how do you get people to read it? I'm just going to say, although there's been a lot of coverage in the Jewish community, in all the email blasts that we received, I don't think there's been a lot of general media coverage of the handbook. How do we amplify it?
I think we just have to keep working on that. I mean, I was happy that we finally had a op-ed in the Globe and Mail yesterday or today, I think. Deborah Lyons is coming to town next week. I know she's going to be promoting it. In fact, we've had people promoting it internationally almost as much as we've had here in Canada. We're working with the print media to try to get more attention to it. We'll be doing some media interviews, obviously, with radio and TV, but again, just not enough interest, so we just keep pushing. A lot of work on social media, and I think the other thing, Tom, that we're going to end up doing, and it was a discussion we were having earlier as we were looking at, the reaction we're getting to the handbook, because when people read it, they are very taken by it. Yeah. We get that over and over again. I think what we're going to end up doing is actually creating some small teams in each province that actually will be there as a resource and as a almost, on-the-road team, meeting with the mayor's office. I was with Mayor Chow last week, and she, of course, has a copy of it, and we're going to be following up with her staff to make sure that they understand it fully, because there are some things that we're going to be doing with the mayor. And I think we have what's called the IRA delegation across Canada. So we have people in Vancouver and Winnipeg and different parts of Canada. They will be experts who will be going out and promoting it as well. We'll be working with law enforcement, obviously, on it.
So those are the steps that you're taking. Let's talk a little bit about the action steps that we can take. When I attended the October 7th commemoration put on by UJA Federation, one of the speakers was Michal Kotler-Wunsch, I guess your equivalent in Israel. And she said the Jewish people are at an existential point, that it's up to us now and we need boots on the ground. So what are the things that Jewish Canadians and non-Jewish Canadians can best do to support your efforts to combat anti-Semitism? It's a big question.
Well, I think some of it is being done now, but I think we could have lots more. Obviously, we want to get the handbook out there. I think that, the non-Jewish Canadians, we talk a lot about allies and the importance of allyship. I think we need to engage more non-Jewish Canadians in this fight. I think it's incredibly important. I think that we're getting a lot of support from the Jewish community now. Obviously, we're working with CIJA and with B'nai B'rith and with Mark Sandler's group, the Alliance for Combating Antisemitism. Mark is doing some incredible work on criminal law, working with training Vancouver police, Toronto police on how we can how you can address anti-Semitism within the framing of criminal law as it exists now. All kinds of initiatives. UJA are doing some amazing work, and we just met with them last week. So I think we've got, in terms of at the organizational level, a lot of connections happening. You can feel the momentum. Allies for a Strong Canada, this organization that's just been announced in the last 3 or 4 months with General Hillier as the head of the Council of Allies. All of these things that are happening, I think, are very positive. But at a local level, at an individual level, I think we need people speaking up more and standing up more. If you're seeing something on social media you don't like, complain about it on the social media mechanism. We've heard from some of the major social media platforms that they don't get the reactions from Canadians that they would expect to inappropriate, what the individual reader or listener might feel is inappropriate. So take action whenever you can take action. Be engaged, as you have here with your synagogue, with your advocacy committee. Expect your political leaders to do what they should be doing. That's your mayors, your council members, your MPPs, and your members of parliament. Yes, send them letters, but call them.
Have you been disappointed in the leadership shown, particularly by non-Jewish Canadians in the business community, or even in the non-Jewish faith-based organizations, not yet finding their way, maybe as loudly as we would like, to support the effort to combat anti-Semitism?
You're touching on a very, very much a sore point for me, because I'd go further, Tom, and say that sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. With the exception of the pain of October 7th and the pain that we all felt as we saw the aftermath here in Canada of the increase of anti-Semitism, the pain that has hurt me in this job has been, additionally, the lack of courageous leadership right across the country, right across all sectors of society, whether we're talking about business, clergy, political, municipal, community. Where are our leaders at a time when our country is facing this kind of prejudice and hate on our streets? And what does that tell us, coming back to your point, Tom, about the extent to which anti-Semitism erodes democracy? What does this moment tell us about how we're going to go forward as a country into the next crisis, which will happen? Will we be able to depend on our leaders? So, yes, I spent my first several months working with political leaders. I then approached business leaders. And I was not encouraged. And I have spoken up in fact, during my announcement, I said that I called upon all clergy, all religious leaders, to guide us as children of God, to guide us through this crisis. Where are the religious leaders? Right now, we're working with Andrew Bennett, who used to be the ambassador for religious freedoms, and he is working with us on a campaign to bring, in particular, Christian leaders together, Catholic leaders, Protestant leaders, Christian leaders together with the Jewish community. I know this synagogue is doing some incredible work on interfaith, for which I congratulate you. But too often, when I have spoken to leaders from all segments of society and said, here's what's happening, here's what we need you to do, can you stand up? What they say, and these are people well-educated, powerful enough, well-placed, and what they say is, can I do it with a group? I don't want to stand up alone. I don't want to be targeted. I don't want my business to be attacked. How can I do it as a group? So from about May, June on, we have been working to try to find ways of bringing them together around different issues. So collectively authoring an op-ed or speaking at an event together. I would like to see 4 or 5 powerful business people, in front of Rosemary Barton or David Cochran, and be, speaking about this issue, because this is their Canada too. We're starting to see it now. I think this initiative, Allies for a Strong Canada, is absolutely brilliant, and it's brought people together, non-Jews together, and that's terrific, but much more needs to be done. But we have to find, I hate to put it this way, but we almost have to find a comfortable way for them to stand up. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I think we have to respect that after October 7th, there was a lot of bewilderment in this country and confusion about what do I do about this, and this is awful what's happening, and do I just hold back or do I actually get out there? We need to find ways of helping people get out there, and again, it's a little bit about what the handbook is about, but I think we have to do a lot more work on that, Tom, because if we don't, our grandchildren will hold us accountable.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. I only have about 3 hours more questions, but we do have questions from a few people, and the first person who's going to ask a question is very much an ally of the Jewish community from our interfaith friends, and that is David Larmour, who's the lead pastor at the King Street Community Church in Oshawa.
Yeah, thank you for hosting this event. To the leadership of Holy Blossom Temple, thank you. And to Tom and to Special Envoy Lyons, thank you for this. This is very meaningful and helpful. So my name is David Larmour, and I'm a member of the Christian community. And I serve as lead pastor at King Street Community Church in Oshawa. I consider myself to be a strong ally of the Jewish community, and I've enjoyed getting to know so many amazing people in the Jewish community. Recently, when attending a CJA event, I learned that studies have shown that when outsiders get to know Jewish people and build a personal relationship with them, their view of the Jewish community becomes much more positive as stereotypes are dismantled. So moving through this difficult season of anti-Semitism, it is natural for the Jewish community to turn inward. Do you have any practical advice on how Jewish communities can find local allies with which to make meaningful relationships? And what can non-Jewish communities do to assist the process of relational connection?
Thank you so much, Pastor, and thank you so much for your allyship, obviously. And thank you for the phrase, this season of anti-Semitism. I'm going to take that. I'm going to use it because it has a temporariness to it, which I like. Not perennial, but temporary. We've, as I've been mentioning, we've been thinking a lot about this. I think it was natural for the Jewish community after October 7th and a few months after October 7th to turn somewhat inward, because frankly, they were not getting the response or the reaction from Canadians that I think that they rightly deserved and were expecting. I think there was a sense of abandonment, and I felt it when I traveled, from Halifax to Vancouver, meeting with members of the community. On top of the pain of October 7th, was a sense that Canadians weren't there for them. So I think naturally people turned to it. I think also with the anxiety and the fear and concern for their children that people felt, you needed almost to get comfort from one another. So now, we're a little bit past that period. We can now find ways of coming together. In fact, that is what is most needed. It's both, I think, a matter of the Jewish community reaching out, but it's also a matter of non-Jews taking the initiative. So I think we need to be looking at both. And I will just refer again, because I love data and I love research, work done by the Digital Public Square when looking at, in a very fascinating, intensive bit of research that we should make sure your committee gets, and Pastor, we can share with you, We're looking at Canadians across the country and what caused them to be hesitant or reluctant with a particular group in society. The first element was proximity. They didn't know the group. They hadn't had any time with them. They didn't have friends or neighbors. And so were they comfortable with this neighbor moving to the neighbor? Maybe not. So proximity, that is huge. I think one of the things we should be doing is actually offering to churches, to some of the temples, to maybe even community centers, the opportunity to hear from Jewish Canadians and what they're experiencing now. To be presenting that to non-Jews, I think people are eager to hear it, and I think people don't get it entirely and don't understand it entirely. And I think Jews reaching out and doing that would now be really important. Additionally, though, we've got to be working with non-Jews and doing more, as we're doing now, I think, with the business community and with different community groups and with clergy and with schools to try to get non-Jews reacting. I know there's a student here from York University who I spoke to earlier who's non-Jewish, and I said, how do we get other non-Jews on the campuses, other non-Jewish students on the campuses? So I think we have to look at all these different arenas and find ways in which we are reaching out to one another. I keep saying over and over, we cannot endure another year like last year. If we have another year like last year of this alienation and separation, we will be lost. We've got to make the initiative now. I had hoped that we would be doing more of it as of September. I think it's starting to gain traction. And I'll just leave you with one more point on this, Pastor, and for the rest of you, because I think it was so telling. We have done a lot of work meeting with heads of EDI units right across the country, so equity, diversity, and inclusivity. We're there talking to this incredible director of a major Canadian company, and she is brilliant and has been working in the field for over 50 years. She's a Black Canadian woman, and she stops for a moment and she says, in all the time I have been working in this field of EDI, bringing people together, cohesion in the office environment, in the workplace, I've worked through Black Lives Matter. I've worked through George Floyd. I worked through COVID and anti-racism, anti-Asian. I worked through LGBTQ. She said, this one has been the most isolating of any I have ever worked in. And by that, she didn't just mean herself. She meant all the people in her work environment that she was shepherding. I thought that word isolating was one of the best descriptors of this past year. So yes, this reaching out allyship, it's a priority.
I know I'm not supposed to do this, but Pastor Larmour, how did you and your church become involved in supporting this issue? Shira, you need to give him the mic back.
So it was actually a call from a member of the Jewish community who introduced us to a relative, Maureen, who has actually a relative who's a hostage in Gaza. And so they asked if they could come to our church, and they spent 5 minutes and we had an interview conversation. There has been a series of dominoes that have gone down since then that have just opened up a wide opportunity for our church community. We're actually hosting an event on Sunday night called Allied Voices for Israel, why Jewish people are indigenous to the land, and we're hosting 2 other individuals on Sunday morning, interviewing them about what it means to be Jewish at this time in history. So there has been just a series. We did a joint Seder event with Rabbi Wernick from Bet Tzedek Synagogue, and just a host of, I've had an opportunity to speak in a synagogue last Sunday night, so the interfaith thing is really happening, but it was a cold call, actually. Yeah. It was a cold call from somebody I had not known before, and they have now, her and her husband have become friends of my family. And anyway, it's been wonderful, a wonderful ride. And relationships that last and last is what I'm working towards.
Great, yeah. Thank you for that.
And again, Pastor.
You can go Rabbi.
Pastor, I'm going to join your church too. But Pastor, are you able to communicate that then to other clergy in your arena? Because I think this is a beautiful story.
Yes, we are, and I've had a chance with our Lakeshore section in Eastern Ontario with our denomination to speak at a luncheon on 2 separate occasions. We are actually able to get resources into the hands of 350 church leaders. That was given by our Jewish friends that was sent along. And I've got a pastor friend beside me tonight that I invited, and he's here tonight as well. So
great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your support. Okay, next question I think is from Alex Henry, a congregant.
So I'm Alex Henry.
Hello, Alex.
First of all, thank you for your ongoing work to combat anti-Semitism. After listening to your remarks, my question to you is, do you think foreign state-sponsored activists are present in Canada and promoting anti-Semitism? And if so, what can be done to prevent them from agitating, particularly on university campuses and on public streets? And the second part of my question, I think you've already addressed in terms of what you think community leaders can do, but why have our law enforcement agencies and Minister of Justice not taken more visible steps to force and to stop this from going on?
As I mentioned earlier, the international special envoys are very clear in our statements. By the way, we've produced global guidelines for combating anti-Semitism for all countries to adapt. But we're very clear, as I said earlier, about, yes, anti-Semitism erodes democracy, but it also threatens national security and international security. And Deborah Lipset and I say often that nefarious actors, foreign nefarious actors, benefit greatly from a weakness showing up in our society and in amplifying that weakness. And anti-Semitism, as it's raged across the country, in many countries, is an incredible opportunity for some of those nefarious actors if they choose to. Now, what I will tell you is that I work very closely with CSIS and with public safety and justice, and I ask them these questions on a regular basis. I also met with many of the chiefs this summer during the time of the encampments and asked about international influence, particularly funding, international funding and financing. What I was told was that they had no evidence of international financing of any of the encampments, although clearly there was domestic money that would have gone into those encampments. We're also, of course, working with ADL, who've done some incredible work on this, identifying funding to various universities. And even in the work that they have done, they have found at this point very little happening in Canada that would be of concern. However, I think with what we've seen with foreign interference in the last couple of years, this is something that we have to be monitoring very carefully. We have to be alert to. We knew from the digital monitoring groups that we work with that anti-Semitism, after October 7th, certain anti-Semitism, excuse me, messaging and videos and so forth were being added to systems coming from countries that we are concerned about. So they were taking the opportunity after October 7th, not just in terms of financial influence, but in terms of information and disinformation. And so that's another area where we have to be paying very close attention. But it is one that my office, I speak almost not weekly, but certainly monthly with public safety and CSIS on this, and we bring it up in every conversation we have with chiefs of police. I think people are alert to it, they're paying attention to it. Let's see what more is going to come, but clearly it's a concern to all Canadians. Good. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I think the next question is from David Gellese, who's also a congregant.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. My question is, given that the IRA Handbook is not a binding directive on how public entities should interpret anti-Semitism, how can we push to make it effective more quickly for those institutions? particularly since education, while extremely important, is more of a mid and long-term objective?
How can we use the handbook to influence public institutions?
Yeah, given that education is a long-term exercise, how can we get action quickly?
Right. So, okay, that was for her.
Not for David?
It was for David too. So, yes, education is a long-term, but we need to be very much focused on education. Nonetheless, I just want to leave another little statistics with you. The work that just was released by the Association of Canadian Studies just this past week identifies that 1 out of every 6 18 to 24-year-old believes that the Holocaust is exaggerated. And in that grouping, there is a greater predisposition to anti-Semitism. Even more frightening, in my view, is that in the group of any age, so all ages, who believe that the Holocaust is exaggerated by the Jews, 30% of that group have very positive views toward Hamas. So education is absolutely critical, not just education of our children. That's why I'm very committed to Holocaust education in the schools, yes, but I'm very aware that we need to be educating the public at large, and particularly decision makers and policy makers. Again, the reason for the handbook. So what we're going to, as I said earlier, what we're going to be doing is actually, we're going to be meeting with each of the ministries of the federal government, of the departments, with their senior managers and taking them through the handbook and talking to them about how it applies to their policies, to their granting programs, to their training of their staff, and to the work environment overall. We're going to be doing the same with provincial governments, particularly certain ministries that we've identified, and we're going to be working with law enforcement. I see this handbook literally being on the desk of so many of these critical intermediaries right across the country. Again, it's just going to be an intensive campaign to get the adults in the room more knowledgeable, and then through that knowledge to take action. I want this handbook to first and foremost be a game changer, a mind changer, provide that kind of context. I am not trying to drive the IRA definition down anyone's throat. I am trying to use it to help people understand what is happening in Canada today and how anti-Semitism is endangering not just our community, but our whole society. But we're going to need a lot of help with that. So thank you for your interest in the handbook. But there's no magic bullet here. We just have to keep working with people and working with groups across the country and holding them accountable, as I said earlier.
Okay, thank you for that. Rabbi Kaye, I think we have time for 2 more questions, as long as the questioners are quick in their questions. Wanda Haber-Kucharsky, who's also a Temple member.
Hello, good evening, and again, thank you for being here and thank you for all the work that you are doing. My question is that we are inundated with requests to sign petitions and to write letters to government officials, politicians, university presidents, school boards, etc., asking them to take action on various forms of anti-Semitism. Are these tactics effective? Do the numbers of signatories or the number of letters matter, or are they just largely ignored? Is direct lobbying by experts in the field like CIJA or CJPAC more effective? What can we be doing that is going to really be effective?
All action is helpful. And I say that as somebody whose mailbox has been jammed by those letters. All action is helpful. The petitions, the numbers of signatories, yes, we need those. Politicians need them. Phoning your MPs. I think phone calls are very helpful as well. Any of those actions by individuals is tremendously needed out there now. Absolutely, groups like CIJA, CJPAC, as I said, B'nai B'rith, Simon Wiesenthal, the amazing work that they've all been doing, UJA, they have a capacity. They have research, they have strategic plans underway, they have people to actually intervene, and of course they can be incredibly effective, and we work with them truly on a daily basis on a number of different issues. But the individual is really important at this moment. So keep the petitions coming. Continue, if you must, to jam my mailbox. I like it. I make sure that others are on the CC list so that all the right ministers are getting it. We need all hands on deck, and the smallest initiative matters.
So I think the answer is D, all of the above, right?
All of the above.
Last question then is from another of our interfaith allies, a student from York University who, interestingly, is a member of Hillel. Emily?
Hi. Yeah, I'm a York student. I'm actually the Holocaust Education Chair at Hillel York. My question is, although it is good that the campus encampments on York are no longer present, Jewish students and faculty are still confronted daily by Palestinian protesters and BDS activists on campus, many of whom spew hateful anti-Semitic rhetoric. As a Protestant ally who is a part of Hillel Leadership, I am concerned about both the personal safety of my friends and the teachers, and the consistent messaging that they are not welcome. The response from governing council and various faculty deans has ranged from somewhat disappointing to extremely disappointing. I appreciate that the university's leaders often fall back on the defense of free speech, as discussed by you earlier, but I can't help but feel that although many of them are often offended by these anti-Semitic attacks, that they are simply too scared of backlash from the pro-Palestinian supporters, including those in the various campus newspapers too. Do you agree with this perspective? If so, how can we convince leadership to have greater moral clarity and do what's right?
Emily, thank you so much for that great question, and thank you again for being an ally. And you're at a university actually with a pretty terrific president, I must say, in spite of, I know, the challenges that York and other universities are having. Look, I'm not sure if you would agree with me, but I have found that since the school year has begun in September, that things are a little bit calmer. A little bit calmer. I don't know, not enough, I'm sure. But I do think that over the summer months, presidents and administrations across the country did have the opportunity to think through what they needed to do and do better. Codes of conduct, we believe now, are being better enforced, more fully enforced. Universities are taking a position of institutional neutrality, which I think is very important. We're working with the university presidents individually, but also with Universities Canada. UJA and my office are working very closely now on an incredible program that UJA is putting in place, both short-term and more medium and longer term, to work with the universities here in Ontario. Just recently as well, you know, Bill 166 in terms of supporting students on university campuses, I think was a step forward, but also I'm aware that the Minister for Colleges and Universities here in Ontario, Minister Quinn, sent a letter in early October advising all administrations that they were on notice to ensure that all students, and it was clearly indicated, felt welcomed and safe and supported in their learning environment, and that any incidents that might arise would be dealt with by the university administration, and that the department, the Ministry of Colleges and universities, would be monitoring this. I think we're starting to see ministers of advanced education as well take a deep interest in how the university administrations are dealing with this school year. In fact, I think Ontario has really stepped up in this regard. I'm telling you this simply because I want you to know you're not alone. And I remember the first time hearing, when I was Canadian ambassador to Israel, from Jewish Canadian kids about what they were having to deal with on the university campuses. I myself, that was 2016, had not realized how bad it was. And now, of course, we've seen how bad it has gotten since October of 2023. I think that it is the priority issue for most of us who are working on anti-Semitism right now. And our universities are where Canadian discovery, Canadian knowledge, Canadian thought, Canadian leaders are going to emerge. It needs to be a much more conducive environment to learning and respect. And again, this is going to require boards of governors, who I am told may have been challenged in addressing these issues, senates at the universities, administrators themselves, to stand up and take action on anti-Semitism on their campuses. They're going to be given, I think, an enormous amount of attention by provincial governments and by the federal government, I know for a fact. So, first and foremost, you must feel safe. You must, as a Jewish student, as any student on the campus, you must feel safe, you must feel protected, you must feel supported. We are ensuring as well that recourse is put in place, that when you make a complaint, it is followed up, because this was the biggest concern that we heard from students all throughout the winter and spring of this past year, that their concerns, the Jewish students who felt targeted, were not being taken seriously. That, I think, is being addressed in recourse that's being put in place, codes of conduct that are now being implemented, finally, after being tested, and other initiatives that I think administrators know they need to put in place. Where are we going to go in dealing with, some of the kind of philosophies that have embedded a number of our universities that may create a kind of binary way of thinking, the oppressed or the oppressor? I think there's some work more long-term that has to be done on that as well. So you're not alone. It's the priority area. Thank you for being an incredible ally, and obviously someone with great insight into the issue.
Okay, thank you for those questions, and thank you, Deborah, for your answers to those questions. I'm just going to, before...
Do you want mine? I think mine.
No, I don't know what happened. Too much talking. Just before we have some concluding remarks from Rabbi Kaye, I'm just going to take my interviewer's prerogative and ask one last question, and it's this: are you optimistic that Canadians have the ability to successfully combat anti-Semitism?
We have very bad days. Many of you in this room, we have very bad days. We cannot play one way or the other with optimism. We have to just be determined. We have no choice. I am doing this job first and foremost for the Jewish community in Canada, but I am also doing this job for my grandchildren. We have no choice. We need more. We need more leadership. We need more strength. We need more education. We need more coming together. But we are being put to the test, and we have no choice but to pass it.
Okay, thank you. Rabbi Kaye.
Thank you, Tom. I just want to, of course, begin by thanking our guests tonight. Special Envoy Lyons, our community is deeply appreciative of your incredible amount of work that you and your office and your staff has put into this endeavor. Thank you also for the generosity of your time this evening, both in your presentation and in being available afterwards for folks who want to get in a few moments with you, including some lifelong friends who I know are in the front few rows. Jews are a challenging group of people to define. One of my great teachers, Avram Infeld, is famously quoted as saying, "Judaism is not a religion, which of course was a great surprise to all of his Orthodox co-religionists at the synagogue. And yet, upon the examination of his words, it's quite clear that actually he is right. Judaism is not just a religion. It is a culture and a tradition, ethnicity, a faith, and of course, a family. If it is so hard for us to define who we are and what we are, is it any surprise that it's challenging to define what hatred of us looks like? Dara Horn, the great modern novelist, shared that anti-Semitism has little to do with actual Judaism and a lot to do with whatever evil non-Jewish cultures aspire to overcome. If piety was a given society's ideal, Jews are impious blasphemers. If secularism was the ideal, then Jews are backwards pietists. If capitalism is evil, then Jews are capitalists, and if communism is evil, then Jews communist. If nationalism is glorified, Jews are rootless cosmopolitans, and if nationalism is vilified, then Jews are just chauvinistic and nationalist. Anti-Judaism is always a righteous fight to promote justice. In the face of such a slippery and mutable task, I am not alone tonight in being glad that someone as thoughtful and dedicated and insightful as yourself is helping shepherd the Canadian government on this topic. You have many friends here. And I know that both the leadership of our advocacy committee and our Israel committee is incredibly proud to see you on this bima tonight. We thank God for you. We thank God for your team and for all of the good people in Canada that support your work. As we close, I just want to extend another word of thanks, especially to all of our allies who are here tonight. Our friends from other communities, from other families who have joined us. It is not easy to do what you have done. And I would go one step further, in fact, and share this element of my own heart with you. When I look out the window and I see darkness rising, it is not my faith in the government that gives me courage. It is my faith in you. In other countries and in other lands and in other times, my community has seen this darkness rise many times, and we carry its scar in us, in our memory and our story. We pass it through the generations. But the thing that separates this moment from those previous times is actually evenings like tonight. Evenings when our synagogue is filled not only with Jews worrying and mobilizing, but also with you. We cannot do it alone. And from the depth of my being, I thank God for you. I thank God for your courage, and I thank God for your solidarity. Friends and family, be strong and be of good courage. The Special Envoy will be available briefly as our program concludes in the atrium. Good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was fun. Good.
I loved your list of questions.
Yeah, well, you know, we didn't get to them all, but we got to enough that we covered pretty well the landscape.
I was impressed to have it.
Send it to her. Email it to her.
I'll send you one. You can have the tumbled up one.
That was very